Hey guys, today let's talk about my top tips on how to do the shooting phase like a boss in 10th edition 40k. So without further ado, let's dive right in. First advice is that it starts at the drawing board and your roster. Whatever it is you want to achieve in the shooting phase, it will depend on the units that you actually bring to the table. It might sound obvious, but actually the most mistakes that people usually do come from their rosters. And let's talk about some things that you need to consider. First, you need to know which part of the army your army is going to do the most damage. So if your army is melee-centric or shooting-centric, or is it balanced? And there's nothing wrong in having some sort of inclination. So if you are playing World Leaders, for example, you should be melee focused. And if you're playing Ironstorm Spearhead, you probably should be shooting centric. But in both situations, I would recommend to have at least some shooting or melee available. If your close combat capabilities are slow, then you definitely need to have those shooting assets that can reach your opponent far in terms of distance, and preferably also behind cover, because remember, your opponent will be using the best thing that they can use against you as a shooting phase active army, which is ruins. So you not only should be able to reach the opponent in terms of the range on your guns, plus your movement of course, you should always understand that your opponent will be doing everything in their power, usually, to prevent you from seeing and drawing angles to them. So if you have units that can either move through walls and move fast and then shoot, or perhaps dip strike, like something like Inceptors, for example, which can dip strike within 3 inches, so it's very hard to screen them and they carry a big payload of shooting. And talking about building lists, if you want my help building your roster, check out the links in the description for my Patreon, where I provide all that personal assistance. These units almost guarantee your ability to reach out and touch something that your opponent doesn't want you to. So having just 3 tanks in your back line, be it a Gladiator Lancer with 72-inch range or a Vindicator with lower range but you can move forward, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to carry that damage into your opponent's units. Also, depending on what is going to do most damage in your army, you need to have a certain level of lethality to your shooting, and you need to test that level of lethality before the game, so that you, first things first, you understand what your army, or what your shooting in this case, is capable of. Are you going to kill a toughness 12 2+ save tank with 1 round of shooting on average? Because in my experience, what usually happens on average will usually happen in most of your games. Yes, it's a dice game, sometimes dice go wild and you can destroy 2 tanks instead of 1, or destroy half a tank, but in general you can rely on the averages. That's how GW makes the rules. They calculate everything. Yes, they know that dice can go haywire, but that in the grand scheme of things will even out at some point. So do the math at home and really understand what you're bringing to the table, because you don't want your army to be always rising to the occasion. You want it to be falling to the most basic level of what it can do, and hopefully at some point they will also be surprising you with its efficiency. In terms of that testing, there are pretty much 3 categories of enemies that you need to be able to deal with if you want to be successful in the shooting phase. First is a so-called tank, which it can be a monster as well, it doesn't really matter which keyword it has. It is a high toughness target, so at least toughness 10. I would usually aim for toughness 12 just because it's the hardest that you will encounter in most cases. It is usually 2+ save, so you will rarely see something that is toughness 12 to have 3+ save, but sometimes that happens, and in that case you just can't rely on it having cover in most cases, because cover is everywhere. So in worst case scenario, you're going to be shooting at something that is 2+ save and in cover, so that is something also to consider. So for dealing with that kind of unit, you need very high AP, so preferably AP3 or AP4, or AP3 ignoring cover, which is the same thing in this case would be. And you need good damage and good strength, or you need a lot of shots with rerolls. Talk about that a bit later in the video. Next type of a unit is elites. This one is interesting because the things that kill elites very well, they sometimes also do quite good against tanks, especially again if you have rerolls. That's why GW always keeps an eye on these kinds of guns that can do well against pretty much anything, because if you let them become too cheap, they can ruin the game's balance. All because they are good against everything, so you can get a cumulative effect of efficiency where all the buffs, everything that you have in your army, will be working towards one single profile that is capable of destroying any target regardless of its type. But I digress. So usually against elites we're looking at average AP, average strength, and average damage. By average I usually mean damage 2 or 3, AP is 1 at least, usually 2, and strength something that is higher than 6 and lower than 10. Strength 5 will probably also qualify. And lastly, the chaff units, which are toughness 3 or toughness 4, 1 wound usually, and low save, and maybe an invulnerable save of something like 5+ or 6+. So there you were looking at AP 1 guns that have strength 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that, and a lot of shots. The most important thing is a lot of shots and hopefully some rerolls as well. So by saying that you need to be able to deal with all of these 3 categories, I don't necessarily mean that you must have all 3 covered by your shooting. If you are a balanced army, or even if you're melee centric and just have some shooting, you can definitely easily just cover the elites and tanks with your shooting and keep the chaff stuff for your melee units, or only cover the tanks with your shooting, tanks and monsters, something that is really dangerous, and keep all of the other types of elites and chaff for your melee threats. If you're playing Black Templars, for example, and you have a lot of Sword Brethren which can do very well against elites, they can do extremely well against chaff, and they can pretty much threaten tanks as well. So you have answers to all of these 3 with your melee, then you can relax a bit on the other types and just focus, for example, on the tanks that can open up your transports. Next is knowing what you will be doing in the shooting phase. First thing you need to assess is the target priority, so what you are going to be firing at. And 2 factors influence that essentially. How badly something needs to die, you want something to be destroyed on the tabletop, and second is how hard or easy it is to kill. First factor, how much you want something dead. Well, it's a sum of variables. First, it is specifically the units that can do damage to your stuff in the coming turn. So, imminent threat. If it is a very deadly unit that is right there in front of you, for example, they have just failed a charge, a 9-inch charge, a group of Terminators, for example, you know, just in a turn, they will come in and they take your home objective and they will kill a unit that is on there, and they will kill it because they have a lot of good attacks. You may want to get rid of them. I'm saying may because there's another thing here. How fast the unit is. Can you actually run away from it perhaps? Can you just ignore this unit for the rest of the game? Will they be able to retaliate if you are not gonna destroy them? If it's something that will get to you, will destroy you, will bring a lot of points to your opponent as well, which is, we should remember that points are how you win the game. If that unit will bring a lot of victory points to your opponent, then they are high up on the list for being destroyed. Plus also fast units are harder to predict, so they have a lot of options for their movement. If something can teleport as well, that's even better. Next, the second factor, which is the difficulty of achieving the goal of destruction for that thing, and potential repercussions if you do that. Will you have to invest all of your shooting or a significant portion of that, therefore potentially leaving some other easier targets untouched? How easy is it going to be to neutralize that unit? If you're looking at something that is elite and a very high damage output, say Hellblasters, we're not going to talk about them shooting back for a second, just their basic profile and how much they do in the shooting phase. They might be a good unit to point your guns at, because if you're not going to do that, they will shoot a lot. Another question, what units of your army you need to expose, so come out of hiding, for example, from behind the ruins, to actually destroy that. If it's a tank that has no real targets for next turn of your opponent, or this is a tank that has very few wounds left and you can almost reliably kill it, finish it off with something that is already exposed, is it wise to actually get your tank from around cover where it can shoot at something else perhaps, and giving your opponents better lines, better angles at shooting it? That's where we go to understanding probability and redundancy, because yes, it might not be wise to get the tank from around cover, but if you don't do that, you will not have the redundancy in case something stays alive. Miraculously, it rolls all 6s on their saves, which it should not have happened, but it did. If you don't have that tank available, then you won't be able to finish off that thing. And remember, a wounded tank is almost as good for your opponent as a new one, because you have already invested your shooting, you have already exposed yourself, and they still kept the same thing alive, which now is just -1 to hit, especially if they can get it to +1 to hit, or heal it, or perhaps give it ignore modifiers rule. There are a lot of ways for opponent to mitigate that. If the tank is dead, the tank is dead. So consider how badly you need something destroyed, and therefore allocate more redundancy to things that just positively cannot stay alive any longer. These choices need to be made before the game. You should look at your opponent's roster, look at things that are the deadliest, the fastest, the most reliable, have the most rerolls available, are also very durable perhaps, so it will be harder for you to kill this thing later in the game. Choose them and go for them whenever you can, because if you don't, chances are your opponent is going to be destroying you with exactly those units. Shoot what you can kill, an old good rule. Chip damage is a good concept, don't get me wrong, but it takes a lot of planning and experience to actually properly execute. So if you try pulling off chip damage everywhere, you will just probably lose a lot of extra models and more games. Because your opponent, if you overkill something, your opponent will not be thinking about, ha ha ha, I've made him use an extra 5 shots from his Inceptors to kill this. He'll probably be thinking, oh god, I've lost 200 points worth of tank. So put yourself in your opponent's shoes more often. If you have rerolls, your margin for error goes down, so you can dedicate less redundancy to a particular unit because you have a little bit of safety built into those rerolls. If you have more dice rolls compared to less dice rolls, so less numerous shots. So for example, Eradicators, only 8 shots per squad of 6, not a lot of redundancy, not a lot of shots in that. So you have to get more redundancy elsewhere to make sure that the tank that you're pointing them at is going to be destroyed. They do have rerolls, but the amount of shots indicates that rerolls might not be helpful enough, because if you're only rolling 3 extra dice and rerolling them into 5s, that is not gonna work in a lot of cases. If your opponent is not gonna get a save, same deal, it decreases the amount of redundancy you need to allocate, because a 6+ save isn't just 16.7% better than having no save. It is also a chance to spike the save. So you're giving your opponents dice to roll, and when they roll those dice, they can roll an unpredictable amount of 6s, much more than you expected. Next, right order of operations. So where do you start shooting in your shooting phase and where do you finish? After you've moved into position, you will have those certain firing angles you have acquired, and units that have the least variety of choices should go first. It's usually something that has shorter range, so just mathematically, geometrically, it has less options, and something that is more specialized, so it only is good against a certain type of a target, like for example the Eradicators. They're pretty much only good against tanks and monsters, and usually you will have 1 or maybe best case scenario 2 targets in range of them. So use your scalpel tool first and then go into something that has more options. So the units that have all the choices in the world, they go last. That can be something like the unit of Inceptors you've dipstruck inside the enemy lines, and they pretty much have the entire opponent's force in front of them and ready to shoot them. So why bother shooting them first? Because you will have more information at the end of your shooting phase than you have information at the start of it, because you will have information of how well you have rolled, how well your opponent has rolled, how many wounds does each target in front of you have remaining, and etc. Also keep in mind that your opponent can be changing its unit's position for a number of reasons during your shooting phase. So first, the most basic one is casualties. Hopefully some stuff will be dying whilst you're shooting, so your opponent can be removing units. So if you have only 1 unit in line of sight of your Dreadnought, for example, start with that, even if the profile doesn't match that well, because it's much better to shoot something at the target instead of not shooting anything. Next, reactive movement. When you get into position, you might trigger said reactive movement from your opponent, which can just completely change the situation for you on the board. So something like the good old Phantasm can really screw things up. Lastly, reactive shooting, we already touched on the Hellblasters. They can be shooting at your unit that you have already exposed to shoot at them, but before you actually activate said unit, and you can lose some models from there. So if that unit is more vulnerable or more important for you for any reason, try and shoot that unit with that unit first if you're expecting to be shot, lit up in your own turn. Next, know your enemy. First rule of our trade, your damage needs to match the wound characteristic or be the divisor for it. So 2 damage guns versus a 4 wound model, or 3 wound guns against a 3 wound Terminator, or if Feel No Pains are involved, consider how good the Feel No Pain is. So against Terminators, for example, a 6+ Feel No Pain Terminator with 3 wounds, your best case scenario would be to shoot at it with 2 damage guns as if it was a 4 wound Terminator, because they are very likely to roll at least 1 6, and then that 6 will not mean anything. Second rule is allocation of AP. There are few things more pointless than shooting a 2+ thing save unless you have no other choice. So if you have, it's not shooting but the same idea, if you have just a ton of attacks from your orc boys and they are going to be putting Space Marines on 2+ saves, you have no other choice but to drown them and dice. But if you can shoot them with something that has at least some AP or turn off cover, do that, because 2+ and 3+, the difference there is pretty much double the efficiency, double the potential damage. It doesn't look like it, right? 2 and 3 sounds very close, but the actual difference is 2x. Same for the targets with worse save like 4+. They can actually be drowned in the weight of fire. For example, Mutalith Vortex Beast is a good example of a tricky unit. You may look at it and think, oh, okay, it's a typical toughness, what is it, 10? I think it's toughness 10 monster, so I should shoot at it with my very heavy guns. But actually, if you look at the profile and see 4+ save, especially when this thing is not in cover, you can figure out that perhaps shooting at it with the lower strength, something that wounds on 5s and has at least AP 1 and damage 2 can be actually the better option. Strength is a bit more difficult one. You definitely should stay away from anything where you need to be wounding on 6s. Point that elsewhere because you're just gonna waste your shots. 5+ to wound is a better situation, and with volume of shots you can do a lot if you have rerolls to wound. So a lot of shots with average AP and damage 2 can do well pretty much against any target. Therefore, instead of trying to chip off a wound from a Land Raider with your Stormbolters, point them at the Scouts, because Scouts will do more damage to you from victory points standpoint, and the Land Raider should be dealt with specific scalpel type tools. And lastly, the defensive buffs. Ask your opponent about the stratagems they might have and keep them in mind throughout the shooting phase. Many units can become a lot more difficult to kill when they have those buffs on, like for example the famous rotate Iron Shield stratagems for the Imperial Knights, and that makes them 4+ invulnerable save instead of 5+. If you have ever played against Knights, you will know the pain of shooting at the Knight only to see them roll in 4s after 4s after 4s on the dice and just tearing out your hair because you did not split fire or just pointed the gun at something else. Of course, you cannot reallocate the shooting immediately after they use a stratagem with that unit, but you can do that with other units. Worst case scenario is something like the Custodes Wardens that can turn on -1 to hit from the Katos, -1 damage from the stratagem Genetic Alchemy, Arcane Genetic Alchemy, 4+ Feel No Pain from their once per game ability, and if you look at that, that is much scarier than just their basic -1 to wound and 4+ invulnerable save. So when your opponent uses something like that, it's not a good idea to keep shooting at the same target, because what you're doing is just you are handing them your efficiency, wasting it. That's where baiting comes in. It's when you are attack a target that you don't actually want to kill instead of the one that you do want to kill, making your opponent think that this is your prime target and use their defensive ability, where actually all along you have planned it otherwise and were planning to shoot at something else and they have just wasted it. Also, when you have gone through the hardship of getting through the wound, through the damage, keep in mind the command point reroll, because if you use it wisely, it can be the difference between a destroyed tank, a destroyed monster, and an alive monster, and we've already discussed how bad that is. And usually a rule of thumb is you want to reroll as late in the sequence as possible, so the damage reroll if you've rolled a 1 is more important than trying to go for another wound, unless you just didn't roll enough wounds and you just want to try and get another one and hope that you will roll average on the damage. In most cases, re-rolling for damage is best. So let me know what you think about my shooting phase tips. If I've missed something, please let me know. Very well might have, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.